Right. Hi, everyone. So I'd just like to introduce some of the work AOC have been doing at Rosslyn Castle. And to begin with, I'll just give a brief background on the castle itself and its history. Let's see if I can work this. So Rosslyn Castle is on this very narrow and steep side of Commentary. It's about 8 miles south of Edinburgh. I'm sure most of you, if all of you know where it is, on a bend of the River Nor. And it's, what we're talking about today is work being done on the East Range, which is highlighted in the red box here. Now, John Dennis and Page Park Architects are undertaking a major conservation and repair project of the East Range, and this includes fabric first approach to improve the energy efficiency, air source heat pumps into the 3 floors of vaults, and reuse and roofing of the Great Turnpike Stair and the 16th century Great Hall. The AOC's part in this is that we have been doing historic building recordings, including dendrochronological analysis, and also carrying out watching briefs on all of the groundbreaking works on the Unified Service trenches outside. So a bit of history about Rosslyn Castle. It's the seat of the St. Clair family. They came to England from Normandy, and they were granted the barony of Rosslyn in 1070. There was an earlier castle. The location of that isn't yet known. So the current castle is actually the second castle. That was founded in 1304. It's in a very strategically defendable position on the promontory above the River North. So it started with the building of the Lantern Tower in 1304. The keep was added in between 1390 and 1418, and the forework. This forework was added in the 15th century. So there's a lot of development throughout the 14th and 15th century. And during this period, Rosslyn Chapel, that we all know, was founded in 1446. Now, in 1554, as part of the 8 Years' War, which Sir Walter Scott euphemistically refers to as the Rough Wooing, the castle was attacked by the Earl of Hertford. Following this, and the part of the castle that concerns us today is in between 1582 and 1597, the East Range, the Great Hall, and the Corner Tower were built with 3 levels of vaults initially, and in 1622, 2 floors were added to that for living accommodation. The 1650, during the Anglo-Scottish War, the castle was besieged and attacked by troops under General Monk, and a lot of damage must have been done because I think only the East Range remained reasonably intact following that. And in 1688, it suffered another attack by a local mob. During the 17th and 18th century, the funds weren't available to restore the whole castle, so it was consolidated in its current state and over time deteriorated. And if I remember rightly, a comment during the 18th century described it as being haggard and dilapidated. There was an increase in interest in castles during the 19th century thanks to the Romantic movement in Scotland, helped probably significantly by its inclusion in Volume 1 of David McGibbon and Thomas Ross's record of Scottish castles. It was a very long title, The Castellated and Domestic Architecture of Scotland. And then during the 20th century, it saw a lot more visitors. Tuning was opened. It suffered a bit of vandalism in the 1980s, and then the Landmark Trust with Simpson and Brown Architects began a regeneration of it. And that brings us up to the present day in the current phase of the work which we are involved with. And with that, I'll hand you over to my colleague Scott, who will talk about the excavation works that we have done.
Cool. Thank you, Stuart. Before I begin, I'd like to dedicate my portion of the talk to one of the workers, Chris, who sadly passed away during the renovation works. Thank you. In September 2022, AOC began an archaeological watching brief for renovations at Rosslyn Castle. At the beginning of the project, I was told I'd be conducting a week-long watching brief on some minor scaffolding works. What began to unfold was my involvement over the next 2 years on all groundbreaking works and the start of my relationship with Rosslyn Castle. The works were divided into 3 separate segments as indicated on the map to the left. Scaffolding installation is highlighted in green, interior works within the East Range in purple, and exterior drainage works in blue. Scaffolding works accounted for some of the most straightforward of the works and involved a leveling of a sloped area to the south and east sides of the East Range. This was to accommodate scaffolding installation ahead of masonry renovations to the walls above, which can be seen in their condition before anything was done on the photo to the right a bit more clearly. The excavation revealed very little in terms of archaeology. No exterior structures were identified, and the bulk of the deposit contained a collection of material from the 1980s renovation, which had mostly just been dumped over the side, such as roofing shingles and glass tenants bottles, and unfortunately, there was no sign of the lager ladies on the bottles. Below this was a bone-rich deposit over the bedrock, as you can see in the top photo to the right. And what was interesting is how the bedrock formation was altered and incorporated in the construction of the castle, which was a feature that can be seen within the interior lower vaults. Interior works within the East Range contained a 2-phase approach, which involved the clearing of the underlying vaults for the new flooring installation, as highlighted in blue to the right, and then the full excavation of the ground level interior courtyard for vault ceiling masonry repair, as highlighted in blue to the left. The bulk of the vaults with clearing occurred in level -1, room 4, and the southeast tower. Vault clearing was also conducted throughout the other level -1 rooms, as well as levels -2 and -3. However, there was often less than 10 centimeters of material removed. So it's level -1, room 4, if anybody's taking notes. Level -1, room 4 contained a partially collapsed ceiling, which had been bricked up, as you can see in the top right image, presumably during the 1980s renovations. Because of the ceiling collapse, the room and the tower were infilled with a collection of mixed material, broadly dated to the 19th century. Interestingly, a mason's mark dated 1691, or at least that's how I read it, was inscribed at the doorway entrance to room 4, as you can see in the top left. Excavation of the room revealed a deposit that ranged between 1.4 meters to 80 centimeters thick and contained a collection of glass bottles, ceramics, candlestick holders, and various domestic household goods. As memory serves, there was quite a lot of champagne bottles, so maybe they were living quite well. Within the tower, the remains of a sealed-off spiral staircase can be seen on the ground floor was also uncovered, and that's the photo to the bottom right. It's a bit tight to dig it all out, say. The interior courtyard on the floor above, the excavation of the ground floor interior courtyard and the tower involved the full removal of an organic layer of accumulated soil. This was done in order to access and repair the masonry of the vault ceiling below in level -1, room 4 from the previous slide. Because the roof over the ground floor had been in disrepair for years, the interior courtyard and tower had become overgrown with vegetation, as shown in these pre-excavation photos. We had also done some test pitting throughout the exterior courtyard and the interior courtyard ahead of any of the watching brief works. Deposits within the courtyard were similar to that of the vault below and contained a mix of 19th and 20th century finds. Excavation revealed the entirety of the top of the vault ceiling, showing the previous brick repairs here on the left. They're in there. And there's one of the laborers in the center to give you a more relatable scale. His name is Jamie. Here you can see the entirety of the courtyard, the interior courtyard after excavation. Prior to this, the area had been covered in that grassy vegetation we had seen in the previous slides. So it was quite a lot of material to move, mostly with wheelbarrows and by hand. Excavation within the tower contained a similar deposit and artifact assemblage. On the left, you can see an upper layer of partially intact flagging stones mixed with some brickwork and truncated in the center where that scale rod is. And then this layer was then removed to accommodate floor renovation and revealed the structure to the right below it. This structure was located in the center of the tower and appears to have an entranceway to the right side of it, if you can see where that scale rod that's horizontal is mostly pointing to, as well as a central masonry component. Based on its location within the room and the size of the structure, I believe it may have been the base of a stairwell leading to a now non-existent upper level within the tower, but that's more of a hunch than anything. The exterior works were conducted in several phases and involved the excavation of viable routes for the installation of a new drainage system and a new water line. This phase of works exposed the most previously unknown archaeology at Rosslyn Castle and was also the biggest headache for the contractor and the architect, as nearly all newly discovered structures were to remain in situ. You can see on the map to the left all the trench routes that were required, and then highlighted in blue are stone foundation walls, and highlighted in purple are stone surfaces. Drainage works involved excavating viable exploratory routes for pipework between the East Range and a planned new septic tank farther to the northwest. Nearly every tested route contains some form of structural remains, and rather than reducing the masonry, re-engineering was required. These photos of some of the stone foundation walls on the left and a stone-cut culvert on the, these are on the left are stone foundation walls, and on a stone-cut culvert is on the right, and these are both located to the northwest of the East Range. Following along from the culvert, which would have been roughly here, if anyone could see that, bottom left of the photo. You can see a wide stone foundation wall on the left of the trench. Presumably, this would have linked with the standing curtain wall to the northwest, which lies, I don't need to see the laser. It lies to the top of the photo. To the right, you can see a cobblestone surface below the scale bar. The gap between the two was utilized as a drainage pipe route, and both the cobbles and the foundation wall remained in situ with no necessary alteration. Several more walls were identified to the southeast as indicated on the mapping from the earlier slide with all those nice blue blobs. Waterline installation involved the excavation of a trench route linking the East Range with the mains water supply at the parking lot at Rosslyn Chapel above. If anyone here has actually done the walk between the two, you'll remember it's somewhere between 300 to 400 meters up a relatively steep hill every day. The route between the access bridge to Rosslyn Castle and the parking lot did not reveal any archaeology. However, once over the access bridge and within the exterior courtyard of the castle, several structures and surfaces were revealed. On the left image, and one of my personal favorite photos from the project, you can see the remains of a cobbled surface over the access bridge. On the right, at the base of the trench, is the foundation for the overhanging remains of the gatehouse structure, which is where the scale rod is right in front of. The trench then followed previously accounted for routes from the drainage trenching which had been excavated earlier, making sure as to not adversely impact any below ground structures. 3 additional walls were also uncovered running parallel with the west face of the East Range. Based on the findings of the combined works throughout the exterior courtyard of the castle, what I'm aiming to do is to reconstruct the original layout of the castle. On the right is a rendition of the castle that from the late 19th century, which you've already seen in Stuart's slides, in which some of the structures are still standing. For instance, the entirety of the East Range, if I could, this laser's not really giving me much, entirety of the East Range, the curtain wall, and the gatehouse are all still standing structures. Using this rendition as a rough guide, as well as the surviving standing elements of the castle, I've mapped an assumed wall trajectory based on the orientation of our findings throughout the exterior courtyard on the image to the left, where those orange walls, I think, if you kept following our results, would have assumably linked into those. As of now, these are our preliminary interpretations of the castle layout, and I intend to do a more thorough dive into how these structures may link up, which will hopefully add to our understanding of the development of the castle over time. So now I'd like to hand over the presentation to my colleague Jen, who has some exciting results from the Dendrochronology work. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to very quickly run you through the Dendro work that we did in Rosslyn Castle. We looked at 3 roofs over the East Range, and only one of them, which was roof 2-1, which is located to the north end of the building, we determined that was suitable for analysis because it had enough number of timbers. The timbers were big enough, which meant that we could have enough tree rings to successfully carry out analysis. So the roof had 14 frames. Each frame had 2 rafters on the upper and lower collar and braces between the rafter and the collar. The timbers were squared blocks of Scots pine, which meant that they had been dressed with an adze to the sides, but the corners still retained the bark, which is important to us because if we have bark age, that means that we can have a precise failing date. Each component bore a carpenter's mark, which had been cut in sequence running from north to south, which indicated to us that no timbers had been replaced. You can see the carpenter's mark on that photo to the right there. And we noticed some woodwork damage before we started sampling. However, we didn't realize how extensive that damage was until we started the actual sampling process, which is done with a power drill, which is attached to a corer, which removes a core, which you can see there in the middle. It's about 10 millimeters in diameter, and that's what we use to measure under a microscope. And at that point, we realized that the woodworm damage was really bad, and our core started fragmenting, and we ended up with, out of 20 timbers we sampled, 9 were rejected because they were so fragmented and they didn't have enough tree rings for us. And out of the 9 that we have, out of the 12 that we had left, we actually had some that didn't have the internal rings, some lacked the external rings because of the woodworm damage. So then we used standard dendrochronological techniques, which is you measure these cores under the microscope and you essentially record the width of the tree rings. The idea being that a wider ring indicates that the tree was happy, it had good conditions, so it grew faster. Narrower rings indicate that the soil conditions were bad or the climate was bad, so it grew slower. And once we measure that, we produce these graphs that you can see down there. And that allows us to compare between different sequences. The idea being that trees that grew at the same location during the same time will have very similar signatures. So the way we compare these graphs is by producing a t-value, which is what you can see here. The higher the t-value, the more similar 2 sequences are. So we had our 12 samples that we measured. And out of all of them, we compared them with each other, and we only discovered one significant correlation between timbers 6 and 7. So that was not great, but we didn't give up. We continued measuring and comparing, and what we ended up doing, since the samples were not particularly similar to each other, we compared them all with chronologies that we had already dated from import timbers from Scotland. So timbers that were imported from elsewhere, but were found in Scotland. And we started getting really good correlations with the number of chronologies, which you can see down there. So that was how we built our sequence for the site. We essentially kept comparing our samples with external chronologies that eventually gave us a date. So all in all, we managed to get 6 of our samples dated, and we constructed a site chronology which ends in 1619 because we had a bark age indicating that the timbers for the roof were felled in in 1619. So we then compared our chronology with both the import chronologies that Scottish timbers found in Scotland and with Scandinavian chronologies. And what that indicated was that the most likely provenance of the timbers was the southernmost tip of Norway, and which could explain partly why our samples were not particularly similar to each other. Because if they were coming from that area of Norway, that's up the fjords, each of these little niches would have been a very different environment. So that was also possibly why we know that the ceiling was installed in 1622 because it was very helpfully recorded on the lintel above the entrance. So we have that date of 1619, which suggests that we have a 3-year gap between the timbers were felled and when the ceiling was installed. And we think this is possibly because, firstly, of the transportation issue. It was coming from Scandinavia. We know that timber from Scandinavia was usually processed in the spring and autumn because the flood water and the meltwater helps with the sawmilling process. And we also know that the sailing season is from May to September, so at least a slight lag is common. But we also think it might be due to stockpiling, which again is related to the fact that our samples were so different from each other. If the timbers was coming from different locations from these fjords, and they all got piled together in a merchant shipyard somewhere, and then they got shipped to Scotland, that would suggest why our results were so different from our timbers. So yeah, to sum up, the dendrochronological investigation indicated that the roof was built using Scots pine that was shipped from southern Norway. The timbers were felled in 1619, so that roof was part of the original fabric of the 17th century renovations of the castle. And thank you.